Hello, class. Dr. De La Garza for Chicano Studies, and this week we are discussing the struggle in the fields. So, there's a long history of struggles specifically around farm labor and farm workers' rights. In fact, um, that was how my dad entered the Chicano movement. It was also kind of my first entry into the Chicano movement. Um, and this is, I think, one of the most kind of materialist, like fundamentally materialist lessons um, in this class. And so what do I mean when I say materialist or materialism? So, materialism is a theoretical lens for understanding um, conflict, struggle, and progress in the world. And um, the notion is it's a critique of what kind of the Enlightenment ideals. So the Enlightenment ideals were the belief that the best ideas, concepts, arguments would get kind of argued out in society through discourse and debate and politics and movements. Um, and people would become persuaded by the ideas that were the strongest and the best and the most provided the most positive outcomes, um, and that society would advance through that discussion. And it's really this kind of deeply optimistic humanist belief, right, in human beings' notion to understand and engage with each other from a place of, curiosity and passion. And it's not that that isn't the case, but these Enlightenment ideals were missing a very important component about what shapes discourse and conflict in society, and that's power. And the materialist approach argues that, like, well, the ideas themselves are great. What really happens is that the ideas that have the most power behind them, backing them, become the ideas that we hold up in our society, whether or not those ideas are actually the best ideas, right? So I think a contemporary example of this is like, you could have one person, right, um, maybe know the truth of an event and try and communicate that event through, social media, their friends, maybe they're a prolific writer, but they're one person. And that one person, regardless of how right or insightful or important their perspective is, right? If those ideas challenge like a large media conglomerate, right, or a powerful institution, right, like, well, those powerful institutions, they reach millions of people. They have millions of dollars to spread their message. Think about advertisers, right? Um, Especially advertisers for things that are typically and we know rationally are bad for us. Alcohol, cigarettes, um, and yet that advertising functions. Even though it's not in our best interest to buy into it. Why? Because of the power that comes with being able to put out these messages constantly, right? And shape culture around them. So the materialist movement says you got to pay attention to where power's at. And it goes so far as to say that kind of the way that we make our living, that we provide for our physical life, so how we eat, how we die, how we procreate, where we live, um, those things have a big influence. They shape um, the kind of ideas that we accept and are willing to have. And this ties into the Chicano movement, right? Because the struggle in the fields is literally about the reproduction of social life, not just for the farmers themselves who experienced wage theft, experienced assault, intimidation, harassment, racism, chemical sprays, really unsafe tools, right? For them, it's a life and death struggle, but also for our society, right? This is how we feed ourselves, the farm workers' labor is what puts all of the food on our tables. And so you've got a very small, kind of relatively powerless group, right, in the migrant farm worker. Um, but they have leverage in that they're the ones directly responsible for feeding us. On the other hand, you've got the government and the rest of society who's very invested in making sure that the way people get fed isn't changed. And those two sets of ideas and those two relationships of power, they collide, right? And you get conflict. And the materialist perspective says that that conflict will produce a crisis in our society, right? And this is true, this works if you map it onto slavery and the Civil War. This works if you map it onto women's suffrage. Like, it works if you map it onto a lot of different political movements. It can help you explain these dynamics. But in this clash, right, this crisis where it's like, how are we going to get people fed because the farm workers are striking? Society realizes that it has to renegotiate. It has to change some of the parameters of how it relates to the laborer if they want to continue to get fed. So that's the materialist approach, kind of in a nutshell. Now, let's talk about the fields. So by this point we know, right, that Chicanos are awakening a kind of political consciousness amongst themselves. They've got a kind of tipping point in terms of a shared collective identity, language, experience. And a lot of this follows on the heels, right, of the Zoot Suit riots, where you see a lot of discourse about the dangers of Latinos and Chicanos. And so it's ripe, this struggle for the field. And it's also important to know that pretty much the history of this country, certainly going back as long as the conquest, it was very common for laborers to migrate from Mexico, Latin America, up north. They'd move with the fields and the crops, work a few seasons, save up some money, and then they'd leave. And in very real ways, the market kind of dictated how many people came over, how long they stayed, and what their conditions were, right? But because you're dealing with a vulnerable population who can't vote, who's been racialized, who don't have a lot of political representation, are unsettled, and are rural, right? And typically speaking, like, rural poverty and rural oppression is leagues worse, just because it's so spread out, and things like healthcare, things like legal rights, things like representation become very hard for people to access in those rural areas. So these are the kind of conditions that occur, right? And then you start to realize that these farm workers who have been engaged in this kind of labor for decades, generations, right? Because of the way that immigration starts getting enforced, with the Bracero program bringing people in, right? But also the pushback culturally from these, different ideas and languages and customs that are coming in as a result, creates a lot of racial tension. Now, this racial tension, it gets acted out in a few ways, right? So what was very common, and this is how my dad got into the movement, was farmers would hire a bunch of migrant laborers for a summer, right? And I'm gonna use potatoes as an example because that's where I grew up. I worked in those fields. So they'd hire you for a summer. ridiculously low wages, um, and they would hold most of your pay until the crop was in, right? So while you might get, you know, a few cents an hour, right, during the week, and that was supposed to be enough to just kind of like tide you over. Um, the big payday always came after the farmer, after the crop was in and the farmer had made his sell. Um, but what would happen was workers would work all summer. This happened where I grew up. Um, and then once the harvest was in, but before the farmer had made the sell, the farmer would call immigration on his employees. Immigration would come, they would detain and arrest, they would scare off, um, and then the farmer was no longer required to pay those wages. And this resulted in, I mean, literally millions of dollars of wage theft, and it was a pretty common practice. You know, farm workers faced a lot of abuse. They were given some of the most dangerous work, exposed to toxic chemicals, forced to work long shifts. Uh, Women in the camps were often assaulted. Um, and so, you know, we start to think like, how how do you create the conditions where this is normal and okay? Um, and this is what the function of race and racism and stereotypical discourse about minorities in the U.S. does, right? It provides a justification for treating people this poorly. So people begin to organize. Um, One of my favorite parts of how this organization occurs is the Teatro Campesino, right? Um, Art can be so effective for politics, and art, like poetry, can be so effective at teaching people their history and helping them understand their identity and helping them grasp abstract ideas in ways that move them. So Teatro Campesino would go into these farm working communities, um, and they would get everyone together and they would help them perform these skits, right? And these skits would be skits where you were confronting as a laborer a boss, skits where you are making fun of the foreman, skits where people are talking back and getting away with it, skits where people are pretending to organize um, a massive union, opportunities for people to speak as if they were giving the speeches that like Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta give. Um, and these little skits and these little theater productions were a way of training people in how to use their voice and how to organize and what to do collectively about, you know, their condition. Um, and it was really effective in helping people understand the movement and helping people understand what was they were facing, helping people organize, helping people talk to farmers and labor bosses and politicians. Um, and, you know, and then of course you've got the boycotts. And boycotts and strikes done well are probably the most effective maneuver that workers have for instituting change. Um, Corporations, especially now, are very sensitive to being blacklisted by consumers because of their um, practices with workers. And so, you know, by creating these strikes, they were putting both economic and social pressure, right, on the farmers. And they were creating a crisis here in California, right, in terms of fruit was rotting, right? Crops weren't getting in. The price of these things was skyrocketing because there was no one to do it, you know? And And this is what forced local politicians to get involved. This is what forced the farmers to the table, right? And this is how, like, the unionization and the struggle in the fields ultimately becomes one. Now, the implications of this, there are a few, right? First is huge changes in the wages and the working conditions for farm workers and migrants. Um, a recognition of the power of collective organizing, um, and and a real cultural shift in the discourse about what it meant um, to be a farm worker and the roles that these people play in maintaining our society. You know, um, I like to joke that if you got rid of all the lawyers, yeah, I don't know that we'd be much worse off, but if you got rid of all the farmers and the sanitation workers, society would collapse real quick. Um, and by flexing as a union, by striking, by boycotting, they really made that point in a way that people back then who were living it could not ignore. Um, another change from the struggle in the fields was improved access to health care, right? Remember, rural communities typically have a lot less access to quality health care. And the poorer you are, the worse that gets. Um, it helped establish legal protections for field workers, um, changed some of the labor practices, including the use of certain tools, um, and produced a very powerful union um, that protected the interest of farm workers. You know, uh, now when I was getting involved, I was 19, and my roommate in college, his name was Leo. Leo had crossed by himself when he was 12 with his little sister, who was 9. Leo came up in the farms. Leo was not documented. Leo was a brilliant, charismatic speaker and just a fantastic leader. And he was organizing in Idaho to secure a minimum wage for farm workers. And he'd been doing this work since he was a teenager. And my politics had come really from kind of the punk scene and, what I knew about the Chicano movement from my dad. But living with Leo, we started organizing. We put together protests and rallies and demonstrations. And that was really when I started to get involved and understand the power of organizing and ways that I could help people with my voice and my position and my privilege. Um, and, I credit United Farm Workers as being the very first political movement and political issue that I engaged in and learned a set of skills and learned to be a leader. Um, and then took those to help other communities along the way. Some of the challenges that occurred was there was an intense backlash, right? There always is when you've got a materialist struggle. So you start to see a tightening of immigration control, right, around this time. You actually see a rift exposed between documented laborers who are part of United Farm Workers and undocumented laborers who are being secretly recruited by farmers to try and fill in as scabs. And because a lot of those laborers are undocumented and coming into these new positions, they're a lot more easily exploited, right? And it's a lot harder for them to connect with the union. And that rift is still something that is being negotiated. I would say in many cases there's a recognition that the United Farm Workers and the undocumented movement, they support each other and they work together a lot. On the other hand, there's some material interests that don't align. And so in work that I've done in the past and currently, I do see those frictions. You know, there has definitely been very limited investment in resource and definitely some rollbacks since the 1980s in terms of protection for farm workers and migrants, government investment in things like healthcare and education. And of course, the kind of dissolution of the Chicano movement that really starts to occur later on, but is very much based in gender and sexuality politics. And the ways that, toxic masculinity and machismo is both kind of celebrated in early parts of the discourse and the language of the movement, is seen as a way of being culturally identifiable, and a way of taking pride in like Chicano masculinity. And at the same time, right, a very toxic environment for Latinas and queer folk, especially, in the 1970s and 80s. So that starts to break up kind of the movement ideologically. And, I would say that the legacies of that, you can see work happening across all of those intersections and all of those interest groups. But that was definitely kind of the poison pill, right? And and then we've got improved representation of Chicano laborers, and an actual union that supports still, right? The AFL-CIO also helps support domestic workers, sanitation workers, construction workers. Excuse me. And those movements and those supports are all also legacies of the struggle in the fields. So, thank you very much for your time and attention. I really love how this unit shows the power, right? That workers who organize and understand their collective interests have. And I think it's one of the best examples of how you can organize typically marginalized, often overlooked group to make real positive changes in society. So, all right, y'all have a good week. I'm looking forward to reading your discussion posts.